Emma Carter had never deleted a single voice message. Most people treated voicemail like clutter. They listened, deleted, and moved on. Emma couldn't. Every recording felt like a tiny piece of time that deserved to survive. Her phone still contained birthday wishes from childhood friends, holiday greetings from relatives, and dozens of ordinary conversations that would seem meaningless to anyone else. The oldest recordings belonged to her father. He had passed away nearly 7 years earlier after a long illness, yet every few months Emma found herself listening to his calm voice telling her to drive safely, reminding her not to work too hard, or simply wishing her a good morning. Those recordings hurt, but deleting them felt like losing him a second time. 5 years ago another voice had joined that silent collection. Daniel Brooks. The man she had planned to marry. The man who officially died in a car accident on a rainy October evening. Emma had identified his watch, his wallet, and the engagement ring firefighters recovered from the burned vehicle. The authorities warned that the fire had destroyed almost everything else. She never saw his face one last time. Back then she believed that detail had been a cruel consequence of the crash. She never questioned it. Grief rarely leaves room for questions. Life eventually continued. Not because the pain disappeared. Because people learn to carry pain the same way they carry old scars. Emma moved into a smaller apartment closer to her office. She accepted a promotion at the publishing company where she worked as an editor. She smiled when friends expected her to smile, celebrated birthdays, attended weddings, and slowly convinced herself that surviving wasn't the same as living, but it would have to be enough. Then everything changed on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Rain tapped softly against her apartment windows while she organized thousands of photographs on her laptop. The television played quietly in the background, though she wasn't really watching it. Her phone vibrated. At first she ignored it. Then she noticed the notification. New voice message received. Emma frowned immediately. That wasn't possible. She had disabled voicemail almost a year earlier after changing phone providers. The service no longer existed on her account. Thinking it was some kind of software bug, she unlocked the screen. There it was. One new recording. No phone number. No date. No network information. Only a gray audio file labeled with 2 simple words. Play me. A strange uneasiness settled deep inside her chest. She stared at the screen for almost a full minute before finally pressing the play button. Static filled the speaker. Not ordinary background noise. The rough, uneven crackle of poor radio reception. Wind. Something metallic striking against metal somewhere far away. Then. A voice. Quiet. Exhausted. Almost whispering. Emma's heart stopped. She knew that voice more intimately than her own. Daniel. For a second she forgot how to breathe. Every rational explanation disappeared. Artificial intelligence. Voice cloning. An elaborate prank. None of them mattered. Because no technology could reproduce the tiny hesitation Daniel always had before saying her name. No software could imitate the slight roughness in his voice whenever he was tired. She had fallen asleep beside that voice hundreds of nights. She knew it. The recording continued. The man sounded frightened. Not panicked. Careful. Like someone choosing every word with absolute precision. The message lasted less than 30 seconds before dissolving back into static. Emma replayed it. Again. And again. By the 5th listen she wasn't paying attention to the words anymore. She listened to everything surrounding them. Wind moving through open steel beams. The distant horn of a freight train. Echoes inside a large empty building. Drops of water hitting concrete. It sounded less like someone making a phone call. And more like someone hiding. She paused the recording and increased the volume. Near the end, beneath the static, another sound became barely noticeable. A loud metallic slam. She had heard it before. She just couldn't remember where. Emma walked to the bookshelf and pulled down an old photo album. Most people kept photographs in cloud storage now. Daniel preferred printed pictures. He believed memories should survive even if computers didn't. The album smelled faintly of old paper. Inside were road trips. Camping weekends. Christmas mornings. Coffee shops. Train stations. Then she found it. A photograph taken almost 6 years earlier. Union Station. Daniel stood laughing while pretending to run after a departing train. Behind him. An abandoned railway maintenance yard. Rusted warehouses. Large steel doors. Industrial echo. Emma stared at the picture. The metallic sound from the voicemail suddenly became unmistakable. It matched perfectly. She wasn't certain how. She simply knew. Without allowing herself time to think logically, she grabbed her car keys and left the apartment. The rain had become heavier. Traffic lights reflected across soaked pavement as she drove through nearly empty streets. Every mile felt unreal. She kept telling herself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Someone wanted her attention. Someone had manipulated old recordings. Someone was playing a cruel joke. Yet none of those explanations answered one impossible question. How had the voicemail reached a service that no longer existed? 25 minutes later she arrived outside Union Station. The public platforms remained brightly lit despite the weather. Passengers hurried beneath umbrellas toward late-night trains. Everything looked normal. The maintenance yard behind the station did not. It had been abandoned for years. A rusted fence surrounded dozens of aging warehouses connected by forgotten railway tracks. Most windows were broken. Nature had begun reclaiming the buildings. Emma parked several blocks away before walking toward the fence. Rain soaked her coat almost immediately. She found a section where the chain-link fence had collapsed inward long ago. Someone had crossed there recently. Fresh footprints marked the mud beneath the opening. Not one set. Several. She hesitated. Every instinct told her to turn around. Instead, she climbed through. The abandoned yard felt strangely quiet. Even the sounds of the nearby station seemed distant now. Water dripped from broken roofs. Loose sheets of metal creaked softly in the wind. Somewhere in the darkness. Something struck steel. Once. Then again. Slow. Deliberate. Emma followed the sound. It led toward the largest warehouse near the center of the yard. Unlike the others, this building wasn't completely dark. A faint yellow light flickered behind one cracked second-floor window. She stopped several yards away. The enormous loading door stood slightly open. Just enough to reveal darkness inside. The metallic sound stopped. Complete silence settled over the yard. Emma slowly stepped closer. Her breathing echoed louder than the rain. She gently pushed the heavy door. It moved without resistance. The warehouse stretched into darkness. Old locomotives rested beneath layers of dust. Broken machinery filled the floor. Steel catwalks crossed high above her head. The air smelled of rust and wet concrete. No people. No movement. Only silence. She took another careful step forward. Her phone vibrated. The sudden sound echoed through the empty building. Emma looked down. Another voicemail. Again. No number. No timestamp. No sender. Only 3 words appeared on the screen. Emma didn't move. The screen continued glowing in her hand while the words, "You're close now," stared back at her. Another voicemail. No caller ID. No network signal. No explanation. She slowly looked around the enormous warehouse. Nothing. Only rows of abandoned locomotives disappearing into darkness and rainwater dripping from the shattered roof. Her heartbeat became painfully loud. She replayed the newest recording. This one lasted only 4 seconds. There were no words. Only breathing. Then a single metallic click. The sound reminded her of an old tape recorder switching off. Emma slipped the phone into her pocket and forced herself to keep walking. Every step echoed across the concrete floor. Dust covered everything except one narrow path leading deeper into the warehouse. Someone had walked here recently. The footprints weren't old. Rainwater from outside had left fresh marks that hadn't yet dried. She followed them. The path ended beside a rusted freight car standing alone on a forgotten section of track. Unlike everything around it, the side door wasn't covered in dust. Someone had touched it. Emma hesitated before pulling the heavy steel handle. The door slid open with a long groan. Inside she expected to find old equipment. Instead, the freight car was almost empty. A wooden chair stood in the center. Beside it rested a small folding table. On top of the table sat an old cassette recorder. Its power light was glowing. Emma slowly approached. The machine looked decades old, yet it had obviously been maintained. A cassette was already inside. Next to it lay a handwritten note. Only 5 words. Press play. Trust nobody. Her hands trembled. The handwriting looked painfully familiar. Daniel had always written capital letters slightly larger than the rest of each word. She remembered teasing him about it countless times while they planned their wedding invitations. She reached toward the recorder. For a moment she wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Then she pressed the play button. The tape began turning. Static filled the tiny speaker. After several seconds, Daniel's voice returned. Stronger this time. Clearer. No doubt remained. It was him. If you found this, the recording began, then the voicemail system is still working. Emma felt her knees weaken. He had expected her to receive the messages. I know you're frightened. I wish I could explain everything. I also know you've spent years believing I died. The tape clicked briefly before continuing. The accident wasn't an accident. Emma closed her eyes. She had heard those words once already. Now they sounded even more terrifying. I never reached the bridge. I was taken before I got there. Rain hammered against the warehouse roof. Emma barely noticed. Her entire world had narrowed to the tiny recorder sitting in front of her. I worked for people who built systems nobody was supposed to question. They moved money through construction projects. They erased evidence. And when I discovered what they were doing, the tape filled with loud interference. Several words became impossible to understand. Then Daniel's voice returned. They decided I couldn't be allowed to testify. Emma felt cold despite the humid air. Nothing about Daniel's old career suggested anything dangerous. He had been a civil engineer. He designed bridges. Nothing more. Or so she had believed. The recording continued. They created an accident. They created a funeral. They created a new identity for me. Emma's breathing became uneven. She remembered that day with perfect clarity. The closed casket. The police officers. The investigators. Daniel's parents crying beside her. Had all of it been staged? No. That couldn't be possible. Too many people would have known. Too many secrets. Unless only a handful of people had known the truth. The tape continued. I tried coming back. I failed. Every person who helped me disappeared. Emma felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The message paused again before Daniel spoke more quietly. If you're hearing this now, someone finally made a mistake. A loud bang echoed somewhere above the warehouse. Emma instinctively looked toward the ceiling. Footsteps. Heavy. Slow. Not hers. Someone else was inside the building. The recorder continued playing. They're probably watching this place. If you hear anything, leave immediately. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence followed. Emma held her breath. For several long seconds nothing moved. Then, a flashlight beam swept across the far wall. Someone was searching the warehouse. Emma immediately switched off the cassette recorder. Darkness swallowed the freight car. The footsteps began moving again. Closer now. Much closer. She carefully stepped backward, trying not to make a sound. Her shoe touched something on the floor. A small metal box. It slid several inches across the steel floor. The noise echoed through the warehouse. The footsteps stopped instantly. Then a man's voice called out from somewhere beyond the freight cars. She's here. Emma's heart nearly stopped. There wasn't just one person. Several flashlights suddenly appeared in the darkness, their beams cutting through the warehouse like searching knives. Whoever they were. They hadn't come looking for Daniel. They had come looking for her. Emma reacted before she had time to think. She grabbed the cassette recorder and the folded note from the table, slipped both into her backpack, and quietly climbed out of the freight car through the opposite door. Every movement felt painfully loud inside the enormous warehouse. Somewhere behind her, flashlight beams continued sweeping through the darkness, growing brighter every second. The voices were calm. There was no panic. Whoever had entered the building already expected to find someone there. They weren't searching randomly. They knew exactly where to look. Emma crouched behind an old locomotive whose faded paint had almost completely disappeared beneath decades of dust. She forced herself to breathe slowly. From her hiding place she could finally see the people moving through the warehouse. 3 men. Dark jackets. No visible company logos. No police badges. Each carried a powerful flashlight and communicated through wireless earpieces. They moved with the confidence of professionals. One of them stopped beside the open freight car. Another pointed directly toward the cassette recorder's empty table. Even from across the warehouse Emma could tell they had realized someone had been there only moments earlier. The tallest man bent down and examined the floor. Fresh footprints. Her footprints. He quietly pointed toward the opposite side of the warehouse. Within seconds all 3 men spread out, silently cutting off possible escape routes. Emma's pulse accelerated. They weren't simply looking for an intruder. They were hunting. She slowly pulled her phone from her pocket, intending to call the police. No signal. The screen displayed only one empty bar. She moved a few steps toward a broken window. Still nothing. The thick steel walls were blocking every connection. As she looked back down, her phone vibrated. Another voicemail. Her blood ran cold. How was that possible without a signal? She opened the message. Again there was no sender. The recording lasted less than 15 seconds. Daniel's voice sounded more urgent than before. He wasn't whispering anymore. He sounded like someone running out of time. The message warned that the warehouse had never been intended as a meeting place. It was only a test. If Emma had reached it, then someone else had also found the trail. The real evidence had already been moved years earlier. She needed to leave immediately because anyone entering the building after her wasn't searching for Daniel, they were searching for whatever he had hidden. The recording ended with one final instruction. Look for the station clock. Emma frowned. The station clock. Union Station contained dozens of clocks. Then she remembered. Not the passenger station. Behind the maintenance yard stood the original station building, abandoned nearly 40 years earlier after a renovation. Its enormous mechanical clock still hung above the entrance, permanently frozen at 8:17. Daniel had loved that clock. During one of their first dates he had spent 20 minutes explaining how the old gears worked even though it had stopped decades before. At the time she had laughed because only an engineer could become excited about a broken clock. Now the memory felt like another clue. A loud metallic crash echoed behind her. One of the searchers had kicked open another freight car. The sound reverberated through the warehouse. Emma carefully slipped between 2 abandoned train engines, staying in the deepest shadows she could find. She was only halfway across the building when another voice echoed through the darkness. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The confidence in it was enough. Someone calmly informed the others that she was still inside. A second voice replied that the exits were already covered. Emma stopped moving. There were more than 3 of them. She hadn't seen the others. She slowly looked toward the loading doors. 2 additional flashlight beams appeared outside. 5 people. Possibly more. She forced herself to remain calm. Panic would only make noise. Looking around, she noticed an old maintenance staircase leading upward toward a narrow steel catwalk suspended beneath the roof. Most of the hunters remained focused on the ground floor. None of them had looked up. Carefully placing one foot after another, Emma climbed the rusted stairs. Every creak sounded deafening. Halfway up she froze. One of the men below stopped walking. He slowly turned his flashlight toward the staircase. The beam climbed higher. Emma pressed herself against the steel support column, barely hidden by darkness. The flashlight lingered there for several seconds. Then moved away. She quietly exhaled. Reaching the catwalk, she discovered that it connected almost every part of the warehouse. From above she could finally understand its layout. Near the far wall, hidden behind stacked shipping containers, was another exit. A narrow maintenance door. It wasn't being watched. She began moving as quickly as she dared. Below her, the men continued searching. One suddenly looked upward. Their eyes met for only an instant. It was enough. The man shouted. Every flashlight immediately swung toward the catwalk. Emma ran. Heavy footsteps thundered onto the staircase behind her. The old steel bridge shook violently beneath every step. Rusted bolts groaned under the sudden weight. She reached the final section of the catwalk just as one of the supporting cables snapped with a deafening crack. The metal structure lurched sideways. Emma threw herself forward. Behind her, an entire section of the catwalk collapsed, crashing onto the warehouse floor in an explosion of steel and dust. The falling debris blocked the men for only a few moments. Moments were all she needed. She burst through the maintenance door into the cold rain outside. Without looking back, she sprinted across the abandoned rail yard toward the old station building. Far behind her, the warehouse doors slammed open. The hunt had moved outside. And for the first time since receiving that impossible voicemail, Emma understood one terrifying truth. Daniel hadn't been trying to convince her he was alive. He had been trying to keep her alive long enough to uncover the truth. The cold night air hit Emma's face as she ran across the abandoned rail yard. Rain poured relentlessly, turning gravel into mud and making every step uncertain. Behind her, shouts echoed through the darkness. Powerful flashlights swept across the tracks, bouncing off rusted train cars and broken signal towers. The men hadn't slowed down after the collapse inside the warehouse. If anything, they seemed more determined. Emma forced herself to keep moving. Her lungs burned. Her soaked clothes clung to her body, making every movement heavier. Ahead, barely visible through the rain, stood the old Union Station building. Unlike the modern station nearby, this one had been abandoned decades earlier. Most of its windows were boarded up, and vines had begun climbing the brick walls. Above the entrance hung the enormous mechanical clock Daniel had always admired. Even in the darkness she could make out its frozen hands. 8:17. Exactly as she remembered. She hurried toward the entrance, nearly slipping on the rain-soaked stone steps. The massive wooden doors were locked. She pulled harder. Nothing. For a brief moment panic threatened to overwhelm her. Then she remembered another detail. Years ago Daniel had told her that old railway stations almost always had maintenance access beneath the main platform. She rushed around the side of the building. Most windows were broken. Pieces of brick littered the ground. Near the rear wall she found a narrow metal door almost hidden behind overgrown bushes. The lock had rusted away years earlier. She pushed. The hinges protested with a long, low groan before finally giving way. Inside, the air smelled of mold and old timber. Her phone's flashlight barely illuminated the narrow hallway ahead. Water dripped steadily from cracked pipes overhead. Somewhere deeper inside the building, ancient wooden beams creaked softly. Emma closed the door behind her and listened. The voices outside grew fainter. Either the men hadn't seen where she entered. Or they had. And were taking their time. She moved carefully through the darkness. Old maintenance rooms lined the corridor. Broken filing cabinets. Collapsed shelves. Dust thick enough to hide years of forgotten history. Nothing looked important. Then she reached the central waiting hall. Moonlight filtered through holes in the damaged roof, illuminating rows of abandoned wooden benches. The enormous station clock tower rose above the room like the inside of a cathedral. Emma looked upward. Thousands of gears. Steel cables. Counterweights. Most of the mechanism remained surprisingly intact. Daniel had once spent almost an hour explaining how every gear worked together to keep perfect time. She smiled despite everything. Back then she had only pretended to listen. Now she wished she had remembered every word. Her phone vibrated again. Another voicemail. This one was different. Instead of Daniel speaking immediately, several seconds passed before his voice emerged. Calm. Measured. As though he expected this exact moment. The message explained that if she had reached the clock tower, then she had already solved the first puzzle. The second one would require remembering something only the two of them shared. He mentioned a conversation from years ago. The day they had visited the station together. The day Emma had laughed because Daniel insisted every old clock contained one unnecessary gear. Not for the mechanism. For the people who built it. He believed every craftsman secretly left a signature hidden somewhere inside their work. At the time she had rolled her eyes. Now. She understood. She slowly raised the flashlight toward the enormous clock mechanism. Hundreds of gears turned her way. Most were covered in rust. One wasn't. A single brass gear near the center looked newer than everything around it. Someone had cleaned it recently. Emma climbed the narrow maintenance ladder leading into the tower. The higher she climbed, the louder the rain became against the old roof. When she finally reached the gear assembly, she examined it closely. Unlike every surrounding part, the brass gear carried tiny engraved initials. D.B. Daniel Brooks. Her heart pounded. He had been here. Not years ago. Recently. The gear refused to turn. She pushed harder. Still nothing. Then she noticed a small release pin hidden behind the mechanism. The moment she pressed it, the brass gear rotated smoothly. A quiet click echoed inside the tower. A narrow compartment slowly opened within the brick wall. Inside rested a weatherproof metal box. Emma carefully lifted it out. It felt surprisingly heavy. She opened the lid. Several objects lay neatly arranged inside. A portable hard drive. 3 memory cards. A thick stack of handwritten journals. An old photograph of her and Daniel. And one sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words. Only open if I'm gone. Emma stared at the envelope. Her hands trembled. Everything suddenly felt real. Daniel hadn't hidden random clues. He had built an entire trail. Every message. Every voicemail. Every location. Every memory they shared. He had planned all of it. Before she could open the envelope, a loud crash echoed through the station below. The front doors burst open. Flashlight beams swept across the abandoned waiting hall. Several voices shouted instructions. They had found her. Emma quickly closed the metal box. Looking around desperately, she searched for another exit. The only path led upward. A narrow iron staircase disappeared toward the very top of the clock tower. There was nowhere else to go. She grabbed the box and began climbing. Below her, footsteps echoed through the empty station. Closer. Closer. Then one of the men looked up. Their eyes met through the gaps in the staircase. He raised his flashlight. And smiled. Not because he had found her. Because he knew exactly what she was carrying. Emma's fingers tightened around the metal case as she climbed the narrow iron staircase. Every step echoed through the hollow clock tower. Below her, at least 6 flashlights illuminated the rusted framework, their beams dancing across the gears and steel supports like searching eyes. The man who had spotted her remained perfectly calm. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He simply watched her climb before quietly speaking into the microphone clipped beneath his collar. Within seconds, the others changed direction. Instead of chasing her directly, they spread throughout the tower. They already knew something she didn't. There was no easy way out. Emma reached the highest maintenance platform nearly 100 feet above the station floor. The ancient clock mechanism surrounded her on every side. Massive gears turned slowly, driven by electric motors that had replaced the original weights decades earlier. The entire structure vibrated with a deep mechanical hum. Rain lashed against the glass clock faces, making the city lights outside appear distorted and ghostlike. She searched desperately for another exit. Nothing. Only narrow maintenance ladders leading even higher toward the roof. Then she remembered the envelope. She carefully broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter written in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but every line remained perfectly clear. Daniel explained that if she was reading the letter, Then events had unfolded almost exactly as he expected. He apologized for forcing her into a dangerous situation but insisted that there had never been another choice. Too many people had been watching him, and anyone connected to him had immediately become a target. He wrote that trust had become impossible. Friends had disappeared. Investigators had changed their stories. Evidence had vanished from police archives. Even people who genuinely wanted to help had unknowingly revealed information to the wrong individuals. So he had created something different. A trail. Not one that relied on computers or databases. A trail built entirely from memories only Emma could understand. Places where they had laughed together. Details only she would remember. Conversations everyone else had forgotten. Anyone could steal documents. Nobody could steal shared memories. Emma lowered the letter for a moment. Tears blurred the page. Even after all these years, Daniel had still trusted her more than anyone else. She continued reading. The final paragraph contained another warning. The hard drive inside the metal case wasn't the real evidence. It was only bait. The real evidence had been divided into several pieces and hidden separately. Whoever was chasing her believed everything was inside that case. Daniel wanted them to keep believing it. Emma slowly looked at the metal box resting beside her feet. He had expected someone to follow her. Another sentence near the bottom caught her attention. If she ever reached the top of the tower, she wasn't supposed to climb back down. She frowned. There was nowhere else to go. Then she heard it. A faint mechanical clicking somewhere behind the enormous clock face. She carefully searched the surrounding steel framework. One support beam looked slightly newer than the others. Attached to it was a small brass lever almost invisible beneath layers of old paint. Daniel had hidden it well. Emma pulled the lever. Deep inside the tower, ancient machinery began moving. Several steel locks disengaged with heavy metallic clunks. A narrow maintenance panel slowly swung open. Behind it was a passage barely wide enough for one person. Cold air rushed inside. It wasn't another room. It was an enclosed bridge connecting the clock tower to the neighboring administration building. Emma stared in disbelief. Daniel had known about a hidden maintenance route. Below, voices suddenly grew louder. The searchers had nearly reached the upper platform. Without wasting another second, Emma grabbed the metal case and stepped into the narrow passage. She gently pulled the hidden door closed behind her. Darkness surrounded her. The only light came through narrow cracks overlooking the city below. She moved carefully along the steel walkway. The bridge creaked beneath every step, suspended between two buildings nearly 80 feet above the street. Halfway across, she heard shouting behind her. Someone had discovered the hidden passage. A loud impact echoed against the metal door. Then another. They were trying to force it open. Emma hurried faster. The bridge ended inside the abandoned administration building. Unlike the station, this structure had partially collapsed years earlier. Broken furniture covered the hallways. Ceilings sagged under water damage. The building felt completely deserted. She finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. Only then did she notice something unexpected. The portable hard drive inside the metal case had a small blinking light. Emma frowned. Hard drives didn't blink on their own. She picked it up. The light flashed once every 2 seconds. Then every second. Then even faster. Her heart sank. It wasn't simply storing data. It was transmitting. Daniel hadn't left bait for the people chasing her. Someone else had turned the bait into a tracker. Which meant every step she had taken since leaving the warehouse had been leading them directly to her. At that exact moment, somewhere below in the abandoned building, a heavy door slowly opened. Footsteps echoed through the darkness. Not hurried. Not cautious. Confident. Whoever had entered already knew exactly where she was. Emma froze in the middle of the abandoned hallway. The blinking light on the hard drive grew faster. Every flash confirmed the same terrifying truth. Someone had modified it. Daniel had hidden the case years ago, but at some point another person had found it, opened it, and secretly installed a tracking device before placing everything back exactly where it had been. Whoever was hunting her hadn't discovered the evidence tonight. They had been waiting. Waiting for someone to follow Daniel's trail. Waiting for Emma. The footsteps below echoed calmly through the empty building. They weren't rushing because there was no need. They believed she had nowhere left to escape. Emma looked around. The administration building was in worse condition than the station. Entire sections of the ceiling had collapsed. Old offices stretched endlessly along both sides of the corridor. Broken glass covered the floor. Faded employee directories still hung on cracked walls. Everything smelled of damp paper and rust. She quickly removed the hard drive from the case and wrapped it inside her soaked jacket. If it really contained a tracker, she needed to separate it from the rest of Daniel's evidence. A nearby office overlooked the railway yard. She quietly entered. The room had once belonged to a station supervisor. An overturned desk blocked part of the doorway. Rain dripped through holes in the ceiling onto yellowed maps still pinned to the walls. Emma opened the window as carefully as possible. The cold wind rushed inside. Below, nearly 40 feet down, stood one of the abandoned locomotives. Without allowing herself time to hesitate, she threw the wrapped hard drive as far as she could. The bundle disappeared into the darkness below. A second later, it landed with a loud metallic crash. Instantly, every flashlight outside changed direction. Voices shouted across the rail yard. Several men ran toward the sound. Emma watched from the broken window. It had worked. For now. Only one set of footsteps remained inside the building. Slow. Measured. Still coming closer. Whoever this person was. He hadn't been fooled. Emma quietly stepped back into the hallway. The metal case felt noticeably lighter without the hard drive. She opened it again. The memory cards remained untouched. So did Daniel's journals. Beneath them, however, she noticed something she had completely overlooked. The bottom of the case wasn't solid. A thin seam surrounded the interior lining. She carefully pressed one corner. The false bottom lifted. Hidden beneath it rested a tiny silver key and another folded note. Unlike Daniel's careful handwriting, this message had been written quickly with a black marker. Only one sentence appeared. They already know about the hard drive. Protect the journals. Emma stared at the note. Daniel hadn't written it. Someone else had. Someone who had helped him. Or someone still alive. The footsteps stopped outside the office. Silence settled over the corridor. Emma held her breath. The doorknob moved slightly. Once. Twice. Then stopped. A quiet voice came from the other side. Not loud. Not threatening. Almost tired. I know you're in there. Emma didn't answer. The man continued speaking. I've spent 11 years trying to stay ahead of the same people chasing you. Her pulse quickened. The voice sounded familiar. Not from the voicemails. From somewhere else. Somewhere she couldn't place. I don't have much time. The man paused. If you still have Daniel's journals, don't let them burn. Emma frowned. Burn? Before she could think further, another series of footsteps echoed from the opposite end of the corridor. This time there were many. The hunters had realized the tracker was gone. They were returning. The man outside the office spoke again. They're here. His voice remained surprisingly calm. If you trust me, follow the emergency exit. A folded sheet of paper slowly slid beneath the door. Then the footsteps outside retreated. Emma waited several seconds before picking it up. It was an old floor plan of the administration building. One route had been marked in red. It led toward a forgotten underground maintenance tunnel connecting the building to the city's storm drainage system. Near the tunnel entrance, someone had written 3 words. Daniel survived here. Emma stared at the handwriting. It wasn't Daniel's. But whoever had drawn the map knew details no stranger possibly could. Outside the office, angry voices echoed through the building. Doors slammed open one after another. The search had resumed. Emma looked once toward the hallway where the unknown man had disappeared. Then at Daniel's journals resting safely inside the metal case. She made her choice. Gripping the case tightly, she slipped into the darkness toward the hidden tunnel. Behind her, the abandoned building slowly filled with the sound of approaching footsteps. Ahead. For the first time. She wasn't following Daniel's trail alone. Emma descended the narrow concrete staircase one careful step at a time. The emergency tunnel hadn't appeared on any modern building plans because it no longer officially existed. Years of neglect had almost erased it completely. Rust covered the handrails. Water trickled steadily along the walls, carrying decades of dust into shallow puddles that reflected the weak light from her phone. Behind her, the abandoned administration building echoed with distant voices. The search teams had reached the upper floors. She could hear doors being forced open one after another. Sooner or later, someone would discover the hidden stairwell. She had very little time. The tunnel stretched beneath the old railway yard in a perfectly straight line. Every few yards, faded maintenance signs hung from the ceiling. Most had become unreadable. One remained surprisingly clear. Emergency drainage access, level B. Emma continued forward. The silence inside the tunnel felt unnatural. Only the sound of dripping water and her own footsteps accompanied her. Daniel's journals remained tucked safely inside the metal case. She couldn't stop thinking about them. 11 years. 11 journals. If he had truly written throughout all those years, then somewhere inside those pages lay the answers to everything. She desperately wanted to stop and read them. Instead, she kept walking. Several minutes later, the tunnel widened into an underground maintenance chamber. Old electrical panels lined the walls. Most had been disconnected decades earlier. One wasn't. A single green indicator light blinked steadily. Someone had restored power. Emma slowly approached. Beside the panel rested a folding chair. A thermos. An empty coffee cup. The coffee was still warm. Someone had been there only minutes earlier. She instinctively stepped backward. Her phone vibrated. Another voicemail. She almost laughed. By now the impossible had become routine. Again there was no signal. Again there was no sender. Daniel's voice sounded calmer than before. The message explained that if she had reached the maintenance chamber, then she had successfully avoided the first search team. But another group would already be moving ahead of her. Daniel apologized once more for forcing her into danger. Then he said something that made Emma stop walking. He admitted that he had never expected to survive long enough to return. Everything he had hidden had been prepared for the possibility that someone else would eventually finish what he had started. Emma lowered the phone. For the first time, doubt entered her mind. What if Daniel really had died years ago? What if every voicemail had been scheduled in advance? What if someone had simply discovered his system? No. That didn't explain the recent recordings. Or the fresh handwriting. Or the unknown man. A faint sound interrupted her thoughts. Footsteps. Not behind her. Ahead. Someone was already inside the tunnel. Emma quickly switched off her flashlight. Darkness swallowed the room. She crouched behind one of the old electrical cabinets. The footsteps grew louder. Slow. Deliberate. A flashlight beam swept across the chamber. It stopped only a few feet from where she hid. Emma held her breath. The unknown visitor quietly placed something on the folding chair. An envelope. Then, without speaking a single word, the person turned around and disappeared back into the darkness. Emma waited nearly a full minute before moving. The tunnel became silent again. She approached the chair carefully. The envelope contained only one photograph. Nothing else. The image had clearly been taken recently. Daniel stood outside a small lakeside cabin surrounded by snow-covered mountains. He looked older. His beard had grown longer. Gray streaks touched his dark hair. But there was no doubt. It was him. Alive. Standing beside him was the same woman from the old clinic photograph. Sarah Whitmore. On the back of the picture someone had written a single date. 3 weeks earlier. Emma stared at the photograph in disbelief. This wasn't an old memory. Someone had photographed Daniel less than a month ago. Tucked behind the photograph was a second piece of paper. This time the handwriting belonged to Daniel. Only one sentence filled the page. Don't follow me, follow the truth. Before Emma could process those words, the maintenance chamber suddenly filled with blinding white light. Every emergency lamp in the ceiling switched on simultaneously. The old electrical panel beside her hummed loudly. Someone had restored full power to the underground system. A loudspeaker crackled overhead. Static filled the chamber. Then a man's voice echoed through every tunnel. Calm. Confident. Almost amused. Emma Carter. The voice paused. We've been waiting for you. Every exit door around the chamber unlocked at exactly the same moment with a heavy metallic click. The hunt had entered its next stage. Only now. It wasn't just the hunters who knew exactly where Emma was. Whoever controlled the tunnels was speaking directly to her. Emma instinctively stepped backward. The sudden flood of light blinded her for a moment. After spending nearly half an hour in darkness, the maintenance chamber looked completely different. What had seemed abandoned now revealed signs of recent activity everywhere. The electrical cabinets had fresh wiring. The concrete floor had been cleaned in narrow paths. Several security cameras, almost invisible before, were mounted high in the corners of the room. Someone hadn't just restored power. Someone had been using this place. The voice returned through the loudspeaker. It spoke slowly, almost politely, as though greeting an expected guest rather than hunting her. The speaker explained that Emma had solved every puzzle exactly as Daniel predicted. Most people would have ignored the voicemail. Most would have gone to the police. Most would have stopped after the warehouse. She hadn't. She had followed every clue. Exactly as Daniel believed she would. Emma slowly turned in a circle, searching for the source of the voice. There wasn't one. The sound echoed through hidden speakers installed throughout the tunnel system. The man continued. He explained that Daniel had always underestimated one thing. People. Not technology. Not surveillance. Trust. Daniel believed he could hide information forever if he divided it into enough pieces. But every secret eventually depended on another human being. And people always made mistakes. Emma felt the metal case growing heavier in her hands. The journals. The memory cards. The photograph. Someone wanted them badly enough to spend years waiting. The loudspeaker suddenly fell silent. Seconds later every emergency light switched off again. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Only the green indicator on the electrical panel remained. Then. Her phone vibrated. Another voicemail. This time Daniel sounded different. His breathing was uneven. He seemed exhausted. The recording explained that if the lights had turned on, then the people following him had finally reached the underground control system. That meant one thing. Someone inside his own investigation had betrayed him. Daniel admitted he had never discovered who it was. He had trusted the wrong person once. He never intended to make that mistake again. The recording ended with another instruction. Do not trust anyone who already knows your name. Emma frowned. Almost everyone she had met since entering the warehouse already knew who she was. Detective. Security guards. The unknown voice. Even the mysterious man outside the office. A sharp metallic sound echoed from the far side of the chamber. One of the heavy tunnel doors slowly opened. No one entered. Instead, a small remote-controlled robot rolled across the concrete floor. It stopped several feet away. Mounted on top was a tablet computer. The screen lit up automatically. A live video call appeared. Emma's heartbeat accelerated. The image showed a man sitting in a dimly lit room. His face remained hidden in shadow. Only his hands were clearly visible. One hand rested on a thick folder. The other held an old photograph. Emma immediately recognized it. It was the picture of her and Daniel taken during their first vacation together. The man carefully placed the photograph onto the table. Then he pushed another object into view. Daniel's wristwatch. The same watch recovered after the supposed accident. Or so the police had claimed. Emma stared in disbelief. If the watch was here, then what had been buried with Daniel? The man finally spoke. His voice was calm. Older than Daniel's. I've protected these things for 11 years. He slowly slid a second object toward the camera. An unopened envelope. Across the front, written in Daniel's handwriting, were the words, "Only if Emma finds me." The stranger explained that the envelope had remained sealed since the day Daniel gave it to him. He had promised never to open it. Only Emma could. Before she could ask who he was, alarms suddenly erupted throughout the tunnel system. Red emergency lights began flashing overhead. The man looked away from the camera for a brief second. When he turned back, his expression had changed completely. "They found me." The video shook violently. Someone was forcing open a door outside his room. Heavy impacts echoed through the speakers. The stranger looked directly into the camera. "For 11 years. He paused. "I kept my promise." Another crash. Closer this time. He quickly reached forward and typed a series of numbers. Emma's phone immediately displayed a new GPS location. No address. Only coordinates. The man looked into the camera one final time. Then, for the first time since the call began, he spoke Daniel's name. "He's still alive." The screen instantly went black. At that exact moment, every emergency light inside the maintenance chamber went dark. The tunnel returned to complete silence. Emma looked at the glowing coordinates on her phone. They pointed to a remote location nearly 200 miles north of the city. A place surrounded by forests. A place with no towns for miles. A place where, according to the map, an abandoned military communication station had been closed more than 20 years earlier. For the first time since receiving the impossible voicemail, Emma wasn't following old clues anymore. She had just been given a destination. Emma didn't hesitate. She copied the coordinates onto a paper map she found inside the maintenance chamber before taking a photograph with her phone. If someone managed to disable her device, or worse, erase everything on it, she refused to lose the only solid lead she had. The location lay almost 200 miles north, deep inside a mountain range where an old military communications station had been abandoned after the Cold War. The surrounding area contained nothing but forests, rivers, and a handful of forgotten service roads. It was the perfect place for someone who wanted to disappear. Or hide. Emma carefully packed Daniel's journals, the memory cards, the silver key, the photograph, and the unopened envelope back into the metal case. She ignored the hard drive she had thrown into the rail yard. If Daniel had been right, it was only bait. The journals mattered. Everything else could be replaced. The loudspeakers remained silent. The cameras mounted in the chamber no longer moved. For the first time since entering the underground tunnels, Emma felt completely alone. She followed one of the emergency exits marked on the faded floor plan. The narrow passage climbed steadily upward before ending at another rusted steel door. With considerable effort, she forced it open. Cold night air rushed inside. She stepped into an abandoned drainage canal nearly a mile from Union Station. The city skyline glowed faintly in the distance. Behind her, the tunnel entrance disappeared into darkness. There was no sign that anyone had followed. Not yet. Emma reached her car just before dawn. She locked every door, started the engine, and drove toward the nearest highway. Only after several miles did she finally allow herself to breathe. Her hands were still shaking. She turned on the radio simply to hear another human voice. Every news station sounded normal. Traffic reports. Weather forecasts. Sports updates. Nothing about abandoned train stations. Nothing about armed men. Nothing about a woman running through underground tunnels. The world continued exactly as if nothing had happened. It made the entire night feel almost impossible. After driving for nearly an hour, Emma stopped at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. The restaurant was almost empty. A truck driver sat near the window drinking coffee. An elderly couple quietly shared breakfast. Everything looked painfully ordinary. She ordered coffee and chose the booth farthest from the entrance. Only then did she remove the journals from the metal case. There were 11 of them. Each labeled with a different year. The earliest notebook had clearly endured years of travel. Its leather cover was faded and worn. Emma opened the first page. The handwriting immediately made her chest tighten. Daniel had written every line by hand. The first entry described waking in a hospital without remembering his own name. He recognized numbers, engineering formulas, basic mathematics. He knew how bridges worked. He knew how to solve complex structural calculations. But he couldn't remember his parents, his childhood, or the woman whose face appeared every night in his dreams. Several pages later, another passage caught Emma's attention. Daniel described recurring nightmares about a woman standing beside the ocean. He never saw her face clearly. Only her silhouette near a lighthouse. Every time he woke, one emotion remained stronger than all the others. Guilt. He felt certain he had failed someone important. He simply didn't know who. Emma wiped away another tear. Even without memories, some part of him had still been trying to find her. She continued reading. Months passed through the pages. Daniel slowly recovered pieces of his identity. Street names, cities, old songs, the smell of salt water. Then came an entry that filled nearly 4 pages. It described the exact moment he remembered Emma's name. Not because of a photograph. Not because someone told him. Because he heard a young girl laughing inside the clinic. The sound reminded him of Emma laughing during one of their road trips. The memory returned all at once. Her face. Her voice. The engagement ring hidden in his jacket before the accident. Everything. Emma closed the journal for a moment. She could almost imagine him sitting alone after recovering those memories. Realizing the woman he loved believed he had died. Realizing years had already passed. Realizing he had no idea whether she had moved on. Her phone suddenly vibrated. She froze. Another voicemail. Her heart pounded as she opened it. Daniel's voice sounded unusually calm. The recording explained that if Emma had begun reading the journals, she would finally understand why he couldn't return immediately. Recovering his memories had not ended the nightmare. It had only revealed how dangerous the truth really was. He explained that shortly after remembering everything, someone attempted to kill him inside the rehabilitation clinic. The attack had been disguised as a gas explosion. 2 people died. Daniel survived only because he had gone outside moments earlier. From that day forward, he stopped believing the accident had been enough for those responsible. They intended to erase every witness. The message ended with another warning. The abandoned communication station wasn't a hiding place. It was where Daniel had hidden the final piece of evidence. The one thing powerful enough to expose everyone involved. Emma replayed the message. Something in Daniel's voice sounded different. Not frightened. Hopeful. Almost relieved. As if he believed she was finally close enough to finish what he never could. She placed the journals back into the metal case and paid for her coffee. Outside, the morning sun slowly climbed above the horizon. The rain had stopped. The highway stretched north toward the mountains. Toward the coordinates. Toward answers. Emma started the engine and pulled onto the empty road. She had spent years believing she was chasing a ghost. Now she understood the truth. She wasn't searching for the past anymore. She was driving toward a man who had spent 11 years trying to find his way home. The farther Emma drove, the quieter the world became. The busy highways slowly gave way to narrow mountain roads lined with dense forests. Gas stations became rare. Cell service disappeared completely. Every few miles she passed an abandoned farmhouse or a forgotten logging road before civilization vanished altogether. According to the paper map, the coordinates lay another 40 miles ahead. Her phone displayed no service for the 3rd straight hour. Surprisingly, the voicemail notifications had stopped as well. For the first time since that rainy Tuesday evening, complete silence surrounded her. It should have been comforting. Instead, it made her uneasy. She had become accustomed to Daniel's impossible messages appearing exactly when she needed them. Now. Nothing. Shortly after noon she reached a small mountain town with fewer than 300 residents. One general store. A gas station. A diner. A volunteer fire department. The place looked frozen in time. Emma stopped for fuel and bought a bottle of water before unfolding the paper map across her car's hood. An elderly man filling his pickup nearby glanced at the coordinates. His expression changed immediately. You heading up there? Emma looked up. I might be. The man remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. Nobody goes near the old communication station anymore. Why not? He shrugged. Depends on who you ask. Some say it's haunted. Others say the government never really abandoned it. He smiled as though joking. But his eyes didn't. Emma thanked him and climbed back into her car. As she drove away, she noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. The old man continued watching her long after she disappeared down the mountain road. Almost as if he already knew where she was going. The final stretch of road had almost completely disappeared beneath weeds and fallen branches. Several old warning signs leaned sideways, unreadable after decades of harsh winters. Eventually the pavement ended altogether. A rusted security gate blocked the entrance to what had once been a military facility. The chain securing it had already been cut. Recently. Emma stepped out of the car. Fresh tire tracks crossed the muddy ground beyond the gate. She wasn't the first visitor. Someone had arrived within the last day. Possibly within hours. She opened the trunk and removed the metal case. The mountain air felt colder than expected. Clouds drifted low between the trees, hiding much of the surrounding landscape. The silence was almost overwhelming. No birds. No insects. Nothing. Only wind moving through the pines. The communication station appeared gradually through the fog. 3 concrete buildings surrounded a massive radio tower rising hundreds of feet into the sky. Its antennas no longer moved. Several had collapsed years earlier. Broken cables hung loosely against the steel framework. Most windows had shattered long ago. Yet one building showed unmistakable signs of recent activity. A thin column of smoke drifted from a metal chimney. Someone was inside. Emma approached cautiously. The front entrance stood partially open. Boot prints covered the dust on the concrete floor. Some were fresh. Others much older. She entered slowly. The interior surprised her. Unlike every abandoned place she'd visited so far, this building had been carefully maintained. Dust had been swept away. Portable generators hummed quietly somewhere below. Electric lights glowed faintly along the hallway. Someone had turned the forgotten station into a working base. At the end of the corridor she found a heavy steel door standing slightly open. Beyond it lay what had once been the main communications room. Dozens of old computer terminals filled the space. Most had been dismantled. Several modern monitors now occupied the center of the room. Maps covered one entire wall. Photographs covered another. Emma stepped closer. Her heart nearly stopped. Every photograph showed Daniel. Different years. Different cities. Different clothes. Someone had documented almost every step of his life since the accident. Hospital security footage. Gas stations. Libraries. Bus terminals. Airports. Roadside motels. Hundreds of images. Some taken from obvious surveillance cameras. Others clearly photographed by someone following him. One picture had been taken only 3 weeks earlier. The same photograph she had found underground. Beside the wall stood a large map of the United States. Colored strings connected dozens of locations. Every place Emma had already visited appeared on the map. Union Station. The warehouse. The clinic. The mountain town. Sarah Whitmore's shelter. Every clue. Every stop. Someone had been tracking Daniel for 11 years. And someone had been tracking Emma ever since she received the first voicemail. A sudden sound came from behind her. A door quietly clicked shut. Emma spun around. A man stood in the doorway. Tall. Gray-haired. Late 60s. He wore an old military jacket without insignia. His face looked calm. Almost familiar. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't move toward her. Instead, his eyes settled on the metal case in her hands. So, he said quietly. You finally brought Daniel's journals. Emma immediately stepped backward. Who are you? The man smiled faintly. I've been waiting a very long time to answer that question. Before Emma could react, another voice echoed from deeper inside the station. A voice she recognized instantly. Older. Rougher. But unmistakable. Don't tell her. Emma's entire body froze. She slowly turned toward the darkness beyond the communications room. Someone stepped into the light. A man with a beard streaked with gray. A scar crossing his forehead. Tired blue eyes. Eyes she had dreamed about for 5 years. Daniel. Alive. Emma couldn't breathe. The metal case slipped from her hands and landed on the concrete floor with a dull thud, but neither she nor Daniel seemed to notice. For 5 years she had imagined this moment. Every version had been different. Sometimes she ran into his arms. Sometimes she screamed at him. Sometimes she simply stood there, unable to believe what she was seeing. The reality was stranger than all of them. Daniel looked older. Life had changed him. His dark hair was streaked with gray, his beard had grown thick, and a thin scar ran from his forehead to the corner of his left eyebrow. His shoulders were broader, but they carried a weight she had never seen before. Yet his eyes hadn't changed. They were still the same warm blue eyes that had looked at her across coffee shop tables, campfires, and quiet Sunday mornings. For several endless seconds, neither of them moved. Emma searched his face for any sign that this was another trick. Another illusion. But she found only exhaustion. And relief. Daniel slowly took one step forward. Then stopped. It was as though 11 years of distance had become an invisible wall between them. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid she would turn away. Emma felt tears filling her eyes. She had spent years mourning him. Years learning to survive without him. Years convincing herself that love sometimes ended without answers. Now the impossible stood only a few feet away. Still alive. Still looking at her the same way. Daniel finally broke the silence. I never stopped trying to come back. His voice was rougher than she remembered. Older. But unmistakably his. Emma wanted to answer. Instead, tears rolled silently down her face. The older man standing near the doorway quietly stepped aside. Neither of them noticed him anymore. Daniel glanced at the journals lying beside the metal case. You found them. Emma nodded. I read the first one. A faint smile appeared on Daniel's face. I hoped you would. His smile disappeared almost immediately. I'm sorry you had to. Emma frowned. What do you mean? No one should have to read 11 years of someone else's loneliness. Silence settled over the room once again. Finally Emma found the strength to ask the question she had carried for 5 long years. Why didn't you come home? Daniel closed his eyes. Not because he didn't know the answer. Because he had lived with it every day. When my memory came back. He looked toward one of the old maps covering the wall. I thought I could simply drive back. I packed everything. I even bought flowers. Emma felt her heart tighten. But before I left. He pointed toward one of the photographs pinned to the wall. It showed the burned remains of a small rural house. The people who helped me recover were killed. Emma stared at the picture. They died because someone believed I was still there. Daniel nodded slowly. I realized then. That anyone standing beside me became a target. His eyes met hers again. I couldn't let that happen to you. Emma felt anger rising inside her for the first time. Not because he had disappeared. Because he had made the decision alone. You should have trusted me. Daniel lowered his head. I know. I've regretted that every day. Before Emma could respond, the older man cleared his throat. We don't have much time. Both turned toward him. Daniel's expression hardened immediately. Emma noticed the change. Until now he had looked almost peaceful. Now he looked alert. Focused. Ready for danger. The older man walked toward one of the computer monitors. Several security camera feeds appeared on the screens. Emma immediately recognized the mountain road leading to the communication station. 3 black SUVs had just entered through the broken security gate. Daniel's face became pale. They found us. The older man nodded. Faster than expected. Emma looked from one man to the other. Who are they? The older man hesitated. Daniel answered instead. They're what's left of the organization. The people behind the bridge. The accident. The funerals. The disappearances. Emma looked at the security screens again. At least 12 people climbed from the vehicles. They wore dark tactical clothing. Each moved with military precision. One of them pointed directly toward the communications building. They know we're here, Emma whispered. Daniel nodded. They've always known. The older man quickly opened a steel cabinet hidden beneath one of the desks. Inside rested several weatherproof containers. He removed one and handed it to Emma. This is the real evidence. Emma looked confused. What about the journals? They tell the story. He pointed toward the container. This proves it. Inside were hundreds of original financial records, encrypted storage drives, signed engineering reports, satellite photographs, and handwritten meeting notes dating back more than a decade. Enough evidence to destroy dozens of powerful people. Daniel looked directly at Emma. This is why they never stopped hunting me. A loud explosion shook the entire building. Dust fell from the ceiling. One of the exterior security cameras went black. Then another. The attackers had begun cutting the power. Emergency lights immediately switched on. The communications room glowed red. Outside, the hunt that had lasted 11 years was finally coming to an end. The explosion echoed through the communications station like thunder. The walls trembled. Ceiling tiles crashed onto the floor. Several computer monitors flickered before going dark, leaving only the emergency lighting to illuminate the room in a deep crimson glow. For a brief second, no one moved. Then Daniel sprang into action. He rushed toward the control console and activated the remaining security cameras. Only 4 of the 12 feeds still worked. The rest had either been destroyed or disconnected. The attackers were moving with terrifying discipline. 2 teams surrounded the building. Another group headed toward the communications tower. The final team remained near the vehicles, unloading heavy equipment. They weren't improvising. They had prepared for this operation. The older man standing beside Emma quietly locked the steel container holding the evidence. His expression remained surprisingly calm. They've learned from every mistake they've made. Emma tightened her grip on the container. Who are you? The man looked at Daniel before answering. My name is Michael Grant. I was the lead investigator assigned to Daniel's accident. Emma stared at him. The accident? Michael nodded. I was the first person to realize there hadn't been one. He slowly removed an old FBI identification card from his jacket. The photograph showed the same face, only younger. I spent 2 years trying to expose the truth. What happened? Michael smiled bitterly. My investigation disappeared. My office was searched. My partner was found dead. I was told to retire. Daniel continued watching the security monitors. They expected him to quit. Michael shrugged. I pretended to. Emma finally understood. For 11 years. Daniel hadn't been fighting alone. Michael walked toward a large wall map. Hidden behind it was a reinforced steel door. He entered a 6-digit code. Nothing happened. He entered it again. The heavy mechanism unlocked with a deep metallic click. Behind the door lay a narrow concrete hallway descending underground. Emma frowned. Another tunnel? Daniel nodded. The original military escape route. It leads nearly 2 miles into the mountains. Emma looked at the evidence container. So we leave? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to one of the remaining monitors. The attackers had reached the front entrance. One of them placed a shaped explosive against the main door. Daniel quietly turned away. They're not here for us. Emma looked confused. They're here for that. He pointed toward the steel container. Michael handed Emma a small backpack. It was prepared years ago. Inside were bottled water, emergency supplies, a satellite phone, maps, and several flash drives. Everything looked carefully organized. Daniel reached into his pocket and removed a small silver object. Emma immediately recognized it. The engagement ring. The very ring she believed had burned inside the crashed car. He looked at it silently before placing it into her hand. I carried it every day. Emma could no longer hold back her tears. Another explosion shook the building. This one was much closer. The front entrance gave way. Through the surviving security camera they watched armed figures enter the station. Michael immediately closed the hidden door behind them. Heavy steel bolts locked automatically. The underground corridor stretched ahead into darkness. Emergency lights switched on one by one as they hurried deeper inside. The tunnel felt colder than the mountain air outside. Concrete walls surrounded them. Old electrical cables ran along the ceiling. Every few hundred feet another blast echoed somewhere behind them. The attackers were moving through the station room by room. Daniel remained strangely calm. Almost resigned. Emma noticed him glancing repeatedly toward the evidence container. She finally asked the question that had been growing in her mind. Why didn't you destroy it? Daniel smiled sadly. Because people deserve the truth. They continued walking for nearly 20 minutes before reaching a massive underground chamber. Unlike the narrow tunnel behind them, this room resembled an old military bunker. Generators still hummed quietly. Large ventilation fans pushed fresh air through the complex. Maps covered the walls. Dozens of filing cabinets filled the corners. Michael walked directly toward a communications console. He switched on the satellite transmitter. Several indicator lights flashed green. We still have a connection. Daniel placed the evidence container onto the table. This is it. Emma looked at him. What do you mean? I've spent 11 years collecting enough proof to expose everyone. He rested his hand on the container. Once these files leave this bunker, everything changes. Michael inserted one of the encrypted drives into the satellite terminal. A progress bar appeared on the screen. Uploading files. 1%. 3%. 7%. Emma watched silently. Outside, faint explosions continued echoing through the mountain. The attackers had clearly discovered the escape tunnel. They were coming. The upload reached 15%. Then 20%. Michael checked the security monitor connected to hidden cameras inside the tunnel. His face suddenly lost all color. They found the entrance. On the screen, dark figures were forcing open the reinforced door hidden beneath the communications station. Daniel looked at the upload. 32%. Too slow. Far too slow. He quietly turned toward Emma. If they reach this room before the upload finishes. He didn't complete the sentence. He didn't need to. Emma understood. Everything they had risked. Everything Daniel had sacrificed. Everything Michael had protected. Would disappear forever. The bunker suddenly shook. A distant explosion echoed through the tunnel. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The attackers were getting closer. And the upload had only reached 41%. The bunker trembled again. Dust drifted from the concrete ceiling while the upload slowly continued. 43%. No one spoke. Every second mattered. Michael watched the security monitors without blinking. The hidden cameras showed armed men moving deeper through the tunnel, clearing every corner with military precision. They'll be here in less than 10 minutes, he said quietly. Daniel looked at the progress bar. Then we only need 9. The percentage increased. 47. 50. Halfway. Emma stood beside the communications console, gripping the silver engagement ring Daniel had placed into her hand only minutes earlier. She had imagined this reunion for 5 years. She had dreamed of endless conversations. Questions. Apologies. Explanations. Instead, fate had given them only a few stolen moments. Daniel noticed her looking at him. I'm sorry, he whispered. Emma slowly shook her head. No. You've apologized enough. She stepped closer. I finally understand. Daniel smiled for the first time. A real smile. The same one she remembered from years ago. Before either of them could say another word, the bunker lights flickered. Michael immediately checked another monitor. They've reached the second security door. A powerful explosion echoed through the tunnel. The reinforced steel barrier bent inward. It wouldn't survive another blast. The upload continued. 61%. Daniel suddenly walked toward a large electrical cabinet at the back of the room. Michael looked at him. No. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he opened the cabinet. Inside rested the station's emergency power system. A manual overload switch. Michael understood immediately. If you overload the generators. Daniel nodded. The tunnel will collapse. Emma frowned. What does that mean? Michael looked at her. It'll bury the attackers. And us. Silence filled the bunker. Daniel looked toward the progress bar. Not enough time. Not enough options. He quietly removed the emergency key from the control panel. I'll trigger it manually. Emma grabbed his arm. No. You just came back. He gently held her hand. I promised I'd find my way home. His eyes filled with tears. I never promised I'd survive. Emma refused to let go. For 11 years she had mourned him. She wasn't going to lose him again. There has to be another way. Daniel wished there were. Michael suddenly interrupted. There is. Both turned toward him. He pointed toward another maintenance corridor marked on an old military blueprint. I forgot about the ventilation shaft. Daniel walked over. The narrow passage bypassed the main tunnel entirely before exiting nearly 3 miles away on the opposite side of the mountain. It had never been designed for people. Only for maintenance crews. It's too small, Daniel said. Michael nodded. For 3 people. Emma stared at him. What are you saying? The older man smiled softly. I've spent 11 years protecting Daniel. It's time I finish the job. Daniel immediately shook his head. No. Michael laughed quietly. You were 29 when we met. I was already 58. He looked at Emma. I've had a long life. You too deserve yours. The upload reached 79%. Another explosion shook the bunker. The second security door disappeared from the monitor. Only one barrier remained. Michael began disconnecting cables from the communications console. What are you doing? If they reach this room, they must think all 3 of us stayed. Daniel understood immediately. No. Michael smiled. You've argued with me for 11 years. I'm not losing this one. He placed a small flash drive into Daniel's hand. Everything I've uncovered. You'll need it. The progress bar climbed. 91%. Voices echoed through the tunnel. The attackers had reached the final blast door. Heavy impacts rang through the bunker. Metal screamed under repeated strikes. Michael looked at Emma. Take him. She hesitated. He smiled. That's an order. Daniel stood motionless. Michael walked over and embraced him like a father saying goodbye to his son. You kept your promise. Daniel's voice broke. So did you. The final blast door began bending inward. The locking bolts snapped one by one. Michael looked toward the emergency overload switch. Then back at them. Go. Emma finally pulled Daniel toward the ventilation corridor. Neither wanted to leave. But both understood. Some sacrifices cannot be shared. The narrow shaft barely allowed them to crawl. Behind them, the bunker doors finally burst open. Shouts echoed through the chamber. Then came Michael's voice. Calm. Steady. The same way it had sounded since Emma first met him. I'm done running. A loud metallic click echoed through the mountain. The generators overloaded. For one endless second. Nothing happened. Then the entire mountain shook. A deafening roar filled the tunnel. Concrete cracked. Steel twisted. Thousands of tons of rock collapsed behind them. The ventilation shaft trembled violently but held. Dust rushed past as the main bunker disappeared beneath the mountain forever. Emma and Daniel continued crawling until daylight finally appeared ahead. They emerged onto a forest hillside overlooking the valley below. Far in the distance, a cloud of dust slowly rose above the mountain where the communication station had once stood. Neither of them spoke. Both knew Michael Grant had made his choice. The satellite phone inside Daniel's backpack suddenly rang. Unknown number. Daniel answered. A calm voice identified itself as a federal prosecutor. The upload had completed. Every file. Every recording. Every financial document. Every name. The evidence had been automatically distributed to multiple federal agencies, investigative journalists, and international anti-corruption organizations. There was nothing left to hide. Within weeks, arrests began across the country. Executives. Government officials. Corporate directors. Lawyers. Several people disappeared before they could be questioned. Dozens more accepted plea agreements. The conspiracy that had hidden behind Daniel's accident for more than a decade collapsed under the weight of its own secrets. Michael Grant was officially listed as having died during an explosion at an abandoned military facility. His body was never recovered. Daniel often said that somehow seemed appropriate. Heroes rarely get perfect endings. 6 months later, Daniel testified before a federal grand jury. Not as a suspect. Not as a fugitive. As the man everyone believed had been dead for 11 years. The world watched in disbelief. News channels called it one of the most extraordinary investigations in modern history. Daniel refused every interview. Every documentary. Every book offer. He had spent enough of his life hiding. He didn't want to spend the rest explaining it. A year later, he and Emma returned to the place where their lives had changed forever. Not the bunker. Not the station. A quiet lake surrounded by mountains. The same lake from the photograph Sarah Whitmore had taken 3 weeks before Emma found the first voicemail. The water reflected the evening sky perfectly. Daniel reached into his pocket. For 11 years he had carried the same silver ring through hospitals, safe houses, abandoned motels, and lonely highways. He smiled. This proposal is a little late. Emma laughed through tears. Just a little. He knelt beside the lake. There were no witnesses. No cameras. No speeches. Only 2 people who had spent 11 years finding their way back to one another. She said yes before he finished asking. The wedding took place the following spring. It was small. Only close friends. Sarah Whitmore. A few investigators who had survived. An empty chair in the front row remained reserved for Michael Grant. No one spoke about it. They didn't have to. As the ceremony ended, Emma opened her phone one last time. Her voicemail inbox was completely empty. Every mysterious message had vanished. Only one new recording remained. No sender. No timestamp. Just Michael's familiar voice. If you're hearing this, then you won. The message ended with quiet laughter. Then silence. Emma smiled, locked her phone, and slipped it into her pocket. Some voices were never meant to disappear. They were meant to remind us that even in the darkest years, hope keeps speaking. Until someone finally answers.